Another video. This one's gonna be worse than the last one. Today's topic is world building, and by that I don't mean the generic sort of world building overview I gave last time, more in line of various different specifics. I'd like to preface this by a certain anecdote. One of the people who was very influential in developing my work, OSABC and Walker, was a gentleman named Progman. But Progman was, what is a kind way to say this, scatterbrained, whereas I tend to be organized and focused when I'm laying out a project. What we discovered is that when you're doing world building, when you're trying to expand out a given concept and a given framework, the hardest thing is not coming up with ideas. The hardest thing is making those ideas match each other, stay coherent, and build upon each other to create a greater whole. You will always have ideas, either from your own self or someone else who helps you build this or what have you. You can adapt ideas from other forms of media. If you can't come up with good ideas on what you want, the biggest block to the drawing board tends to be, well, what do I need from the world you're building? If, for example, you are building a sci-fi world, there are certain common elements you have to have. You have to have some method of science for faster than light travel, or it has to be focused within a solar system. You have to have a basis of the economy. You have to have an understanding of, is this a human-centric, or is it going to include aliens, or is it alien-centric? You need to set these things out first before you even set paper and pencil together on trying to design it. Once you define what you need, you can start drawing out further. So let's begin with defining what you need. The main things you will need, regardless of what kind of world you're doing, fan fiction, your own things, whatever, is the ability to hang a story on it. And I will give you two examples of good and bad world building. When you're building your framework for your world, if everything you're adding in is being added because it's cool or it's something that you like, but you don't really plan to use it, you're wasting your time. You see a lot of this in real professional media. You see a lot of this in fan fiction. You see a lot of extraneous detail that serves no purpose and doesn't actually interact with the story. It's just there for the sake of being there. And people say, oh, well, it's richly detailed. Yes, but you do nothing with it. Anything that you create that has no bearing on the story and is fluff, cut it out. It will only make your world building harder, because you're going to try to integrate this stuff into your story, except you didn't plan for it to be a part of your story. Trust me, I have shot myself in the foot with this enough times to know what I'm talking about. So, good world building, on the other hand, is you know the basics of what you want to build, and each thing that you're laying out is a support for that. Examples could vary, but let's say you're doing a Wild West setting. You need to define, why are people out in the Wild West anyway? Gold rush or some other similar thing that would draw adventuresome people out. You need to define how far out into the wilderness this is and how dangerous the wilderness is to set both your place of adventure and your filter for the type of people who could make the trip. You need to define how much of the resources there. Is this going to be a long... Is this something that can support a civilizational outpost like a Wild West town for years and decades, or is this going to end up in a ghost town in a few years? The reason you want to do those things at the outset before you build out anything else is that those are what define your story's boundaries. It helps you say, okay, we know that we put this out in the middle of the wilderness, and there's no transportation network, and it's a giant, huge strike of diamonds. And it's not going away anytime soon, but there's no infrastructure coming this way anytime soon either. So you're going to have athletic, adventuresome, driven people who make the trip, because those are the only ones that are going to survive. A fat banker from the comforts of civilization is not going to be there. Likewise, if there's no good infrastructure, you have to determine exactly how this is happening. Now, immediately to me, that means you have caravans traveling from the ghost town, the boomstrike town back towards civilization. Well, that's another story point. There could be attacks. There could be robberies. There could be way stations built along the line. There may be even a group that makes money by building wing stations along the line to ensure the safe transfer of diamonds. Once you start building thematically instead of organically, you will find that the story starts building itself out. That elements and frameworks snap into place without you even really having to do much heavy thinking. Then you have to ask how we got to a certain point, and that's a little bit more tricky. It's still in the how do you get started framework, but the how do we get to this point gives you your backstory. I'll use a different example this time. Let's say that you're doing human solar system restricted science fiction, and there's clashes between Earth and the Jovian colonies. Not like you haven't heard this one before. Well, how did we get to this point, given that you can't really have life on any of the planets in the solar system without heavy life support from Earth in terms of water and things like that? So you have to build up infrastructure in what you're building. There's ice asteroids you're mining. There's chemical refineries that are cracking things to produce oxygen and produce nutrients and fertilizers to produce algae, to produce a biosphere. And each of those things took time. And then you have to understand what the stressors were that led to a break between the Earth and the colonies. Was it pricing? Was it mega corporations gouging the settlers on money, or not enough investment? Once you have what you need to build it, and once you know how you got to that point, the story will tend to build itself. Now, the second problem people run into is like, well, I don't even know what the story I want to write is. Then why are you world building? And don't get me wrong, I've seen this. I've seen people who have this great idea, this wonderful concept. Progman was like this. And then getting to that point was less important than building all the ramifications of the point out. Like, well, if we have this story, we could do this, and we could do that, and we could do this. And yes, there's all kinds of things you can do. That doesn't mean you're going to be successful doing them, unfortunately. You have to ask yourself, how do people live in this world? That will give you the basis of whatever story you're trying to write, I assure you. Take my favorite game, Mass Effect. At the very beginning, before they do anything else, they lay out the Mass Effect and the ramifications it has on galactic society. And everything from drives to sensors to weapons technology to the industries and the economies is all driven around the Mass Effect. You don't have to know every aspect of the story you want to write to get the underlying basics you need to determine what you're going to need from the world building. If that seems a little bit confusing, well, it is a little bit confusing. There's lots of things that don't fall into place. How do they eat? How do they speak? How do they work? Cultural aspects. And it will always segue into other areas. And keep in mind that simple and easy are not the same thing. Chess is a very simple game, but it's not easy to master. Asking the basic questions at the framework of what you're building gives you a place to start. And they build on each other, like I said, thematically. At the same time, you still have to know where you plan to go with this overall. The biggest hurdle, as I put out in my little documentation, in setting up your environment, is what I like to call the Big Six. The Big Six is a way to describe any environment, from Stone Age to post-singularity level. The Big Six are economy, travel, biology, nature, tech level, and communications. These make up the framework of any culture, so they make up the framework of any world building. If you have a civilization that doesn't have one of these aspects, it's going to be very difficult to describe it. And every one of these is a facet of the whole concept that you're working on for the world, without necessarily being exclusive. You want to make these things as dumb and as simple as possible. Mass Effect did this beautifully. What's the basis of the economy? EZO. Trade. How do people get from place to place? Relays, using EZO. Who lives here and how are they alien? It laid out all the races and very basic biology for each without going into much detail about their actual cultures. The nature of the world was many different planets. The tech level was kind of even because everyone was using the same tech base, which they didn't even come up with, which is very handy and very clever on BioWare's part. And communications. Now, of those, you will find at almost every story flubs one of them. And what I mean by flubs is that it doesn't go into the details of how this actually works. It doesn't go into the specifics, and it doesn't pin you down saying A, B, C, D, E. Mass Effect is very good at detailing things like economies and aliens and technology and how they all fit together. I have no idea how communication works in canon. Don't let an inability to come up with details on the Big Six stop you. Just lay out the very simple basics. Even if it's a missing, if you don't have an economy, for example, then you need to justify why that element is missing. Once you lay out what you need from the world and the Big Six of the larger framework, you'll find most other things are going to fall and trickle down from that. And you want to build piecemeal. You define what the scope is. Is it a city? Is it a nation, a continent, a world, a planet, a solar system, galaxy, whatever? You ask the basic questions. You deduce what that does to the inhabitants and what it does to your story and how the two interact. And then you start changing things that don't fit and note why it doesn't fit. From there, you take a real-world analog of the situation, if you can. Something that happens every day, and you try to map what you're doing to that. For mining a concept or an ideal. Most of the intricate economy I've plotted out in my own fix is merely rehashing and rethreading our current day economy. I didn't invent anything with that, I just copied it because it's the simplest and easiest way to handle it. And then make sure you have notations of what you're building, why you're building it, so that later on in the story you can go back and reference that and work it in. And this is how you get what they call the rich worlds, where your story is constantly interwoven with the fabric of what you've built, with references, with reasons why this or that or the other thing is a thing. And now you have a scaffolding. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. But what I found is that people get caught up in not having a process to follow rather than a lack of ideas. They get caught up in the daunting scope of what they want at the end instead of looking at the beginning. And part of this is just psychology. We're all like that. Anytime you start to take a new task in, it looks incredibly daunting. And then you break it down piecemeal, and then by the end of the journey, you're like, well, that was easy. But it wasn't taken all at one time. Likewise, rules of thumb when you're creating your world are not entirely useful, because everyone has different ways of looking at things, and on top of that, everyone has different aspects that they tend to focus on. I'm a storyteller. I focus on how I can leverage elements of what I've built to build on the story. Some people are slice of life people. The setting is actually kind of superfluous in that. If you do world building in a slice of life thing, it's mostly to provide a backdrop to what the characters are doing. Some people write very detailed, very technical, interlayered, interrelational things, where the world building doesn't begin at the story and it evolves as the story expands and as the scope expands. That's really the hardest to pull off, because you didn't build it with the story as your underlying foundation, so you have to be careful you don't paint yourself in or contradict yourself. All of these things, again, like I said, are very vague and generic. There's no simple, easy way to lay out concepts for anything, much less fiction, that will always produce a result that's just great. Doesn't happen for a number of reasons. The main one being that we're all going to have differences of ability when it comes to imagining one thing or the other. That being said, there are 3 thingies that I choose to try to rely on when I'm building my stories. The first, and I know, God, the people who are in my Discord must have heard this 1,000 times. The first thing that you have to focus on, though, is simple. Don't emphasize the wrong shit. At the end of the day, world building is only there to provide you a canvas to paint something else on. World building for the sake of building out a world is kind of pointless unless you're running an RP campaign, and even then you're going to use it to perform role-playing. The more effort you put into world building, whether or not you can use it or not, the more likely you are to overdevelop it. And by overdevelop it, I mean you've gone now into so much detail, and you've gone into such a level of work into it that you run into the sunk cost fallacy, and now you have to incorporate this into the story because you've spent 30 days on it, and it may not be the best fit. You see this a lot in crossovers where people want to incorporate this element or that element even though it's not thematically appropriate at all, and the story suffers. Now, I'm not talking about the basics of your world being too complicated. I'm talking about taking one element and pushing it too far. Don't emphasize the wrong shit. At the very simplest means, focus mostly on the things that help you push the story, not the rule of cool. The second thingy I tend to use is simpler. The second thing is to be able to delineate between core and fringe aspects of when you're building. Don't give me that look. I'm not a professional video maker. By core and fringe, I mean there are aspects of your storyline and your world that you will obviously need to interweave. And then there's obviously background. What really blows people's mind is when the background characters interact with the background story. In the course of events, minor, small people, Joker and China, for example, are not hugely important. But BioWare does a good job of showing little tiny things. It didn't take much time to go over, of how they're interrelated. Don't waste time trying to make everything big. Focus some on the smaller details that you can use to introduce or surround or preface minor characters with. And you'll find you have more freedom in the long run. The final tidbit, if you can call it a tidbit, or thingy, I tend to use and rely on a lot when I'm building worlds, is steal where you can from real life. Be that people, cultures, history, whatever. 9 times out of 10, when I'm building out a framework, I use a real world system as a template. And I lay down pieces of that and adjust the names, file off the serial numbers. Every one of the cultures I built in the PV is basically a human culture I twisted. With a few elements here and there from canon that had to be tweaked. You will find 2 things happen when you do this. One is that everything has a level of consistency to it that something you make from scratch may not. It all tends to fit together much tighter. And the second is that now you have an entire history of real things to pull your fantasy things from. Famous battles, famous people, quotations. All of that is right there. It really happened. It's already set into history. It actually arose from that setting. And you can adapt it in a number of ways where no one will be able to tell in the slightest what you did. And yet will make everything seem really well put together. This is just the basics. The next 2 pieces of world building are designing a culture and designing believable campaigns, and we'll see how that goes.